Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to class number 92. This will be the first of possibly two classes on what is really the last book in a series that began with the metaphorical nature of physical reality, a sort of sequence of 4 or 5 books that give an ever more sort of begin at the beginning of why physical creation and then proceeds to this conclusion. As you will see, I will show you on one of the slides what the upcoming classes will be about. I've told you they'll be about my books, but I'll show you the sequence and what will be our concluding class, which will be on the Baluzzi lecture I gave a long time ago. I think it was 1999, but it's still quite funny, actually. So let me share my screen, and we shall begin. Close connections, the bridge between spiritual and physical reality. Now, of course, the reason that this is a sort of conclusion to this sequence is that this is sort of an overview insofar as the various sciences are concerned about the unity between science and religion. This can be understood or misunderstood, this concept of the unity between science and religion, as a concept of that we should coerce the people in science and religion to sort of get along. You know, why can't you two stop arguing? But that's not what it means, of course. In the Baha'i writings, it means that physical and spiritual reality are already united. They are part of one organic system, 2 dimensions of which, the principal one of which is the spiritual reality. That's the real world, according to the Baha'i writings, and this nether world, as Abdul Baha calls it, is but its shadow stretching out, and we'll read something about that. So the remaining classes will be this class, and then if we need one more on this subject, we will have it. The same goes for any of the classes. If we need more than one, we will have them. So the rest of the classes, I'm presuming we can at least cover the highlights, because I'm not trying to give you a complete view of these books or a complete outline of everything in them. Though I do base my talks on the table of contents for each book. Will be class 94, then would be Understanding Death, the most important event in your life. From Sin to Salvation, the Ascent of the Soul, and this is about the Baha'i concept of what is sin, and such questions as, can you sin unknowingly or unwittingly? Or does it have to be a conscious, willful act? And does it have to be done in knowledge of the fact that it is sinful, and so on? It's an interesting discussion. In the beginning was a word, how language knits reality together. And of course, we're all familiar with 1 John, that is quoted in the Baha'i writings a lot, where Abdul Baha talks about this concept of, in the beginning was a word, is actually a reference to the manifestation. That before you have creation, you have the manifestation who brings about creation, or brings creation into being. And this is about the fact that the language, that how important language is, because after all, that's the principal way we recognize them, is their utterances, and the principal way that they are connected one to another. Class 97, God's Plan for Planet Earth and for Your Neighborhood. This is a review of the plans of the House of Justice, the recent ones, and how they do focus on working at the grassroots level in order to bring about the lesser peace and the progress of the world in general. The Class 98, The Life and Poetry of Robert E. Hayden. Now, Robert Hayden was the best known Baha'i poet, and rightly so. He was the first African-American poet to be appointed Poet Laureate of the United States. He was a friend of mine and one of the early Baha'is I knew, and so this book about him was a very important book to me. In fact, it was one of the first major scholarly books that of mine that received wide distribution. The Class 99, A Sense of History, The Poetry of John S. Hatcher. This is a collection of my own poetry. It is also sort of one narrative, if you will. It's many of the poems are autobiographically based, and the sort of a synthesis of several histories, my personal history, the history of the world, and finally it focuses on the history of the Baha'i faith. The Reunion with the Beloved. This is a collection of poetry about and by martyrs of the faith, such as Varga, the dove, the one who was executed alongside of his 12-year-old son Ruhullah, and it has some poems by him and others, some contemporary prisoners, and so on. This is translated from Persian, and it contains both the English and the original Persian versions of the poems. The Poetry of Tahirih. This is a book published by George Ronald that contains some of the better known poems of Tahirih, and this was done, as was the previous book, in collaboration, my collaboration with Amrullah Himmat, who is a Baha'i whom I have been working with for over 25 years. We've done 5 books together, and he is currently pioneering in China and is head of BIHE, which is the Baha'i Institute of Higher Education, which provides online courses and degrees for those Baha'is who are in Iran and have no other access to higher education. The next book is Adam's Wish, Unknown Poetry of Tahirih. We were fortunate enough, Amrullah and I, to come through various means that are explained in the introductions to these books, upon 3 different manuscripts, not at the same time, but in succession, of poetry of Tahirih, some of them in their original manuscript form, that were copied down from Tahirih by a contemporary of Tahirih's. All of these were. So the first 2 books of these are Adam's Wish, which has to do, well, I will explain it when we get to it. And then another collection of hers, The Quickening, which is about the coming of the resurrection, or in effect, the advent of the Bab from a Baha'i point of view, but all of the events that were prophesied in the Quran that would occur at the time of the second coming of Christ, the resurrection, and so forth. And the quickening is a term she uses, and we liked it very much, so we used it. Then the fourth book of we did on the poetry of Tahirih, Sparks of Fire. That is not out yet. It will be published by the Publishing Trust during this year. And this is, well, again, we'll talk about it when we get to it. I want to talk about each one of them as I look at the title. And then the final class is The Mind of God and the Structure of Reality. This is a discussion about how reality comes into being the way it does, in the sense that if you know the mind of God, and we've already talked about the body of God in the Surah Haykal, indirectly. But if you know the mind of God, and the Baha'i writings provide us an insight into the mind of God, meaning what he desires and how he desires to bring about his purpose for creation, then the structure of reality derives directly from it. To put it more simply, there's no other way reality could be than the way it is for God to bring about the objective of creation. All right. So I think I just gave you a synopsis of that book. So let's begin then with the close connections. As I say, it's a very thick book, both literally and figuratively, and it attempts to go into a number of different areas. I said it was published in 2005, and it's sort of the end of that sequence that began with the metaphorical nature of physical reality, then physical reality, then the purpose of physical reality, the arc of ascent, and the ascent of society. And this is sort of the conclusion of that sequence of works. It is available, as it says here, on Amazon and through the U.S. Baha'i Bookstore, and it's also available in ebook. This is the table of contents. Excuse me, I went over to the value. So we're going to go over that one chapter at a time with just a brief synopsis on my part. Again, my idea here is not to talk in great detail about the book. That would be impossible. But the sequence has to do with the beginning and then going up through the evolution, then the concept of the cosmos, and so on. The various areas in which science and religion both have a vision or a belief, and more often than not, they don't agree. And yet the Baha'i writings, and indeed this book, attempt to show how they do agree or can agree. Now, I've changed one of my own understandings of course, I've gained a lot more understanding in the intervening years, but particularly of evolution. So the way evolution is presented in this book is wrong. And I'll explain why and how I came to the wrong conclusion. It was not a fault on my own. It was a total misunderstanding of a statement by Abdu'l-Baha in Some Answered Questions in the chapter on evolution, which is straightened out much more clearly in the new version of, in the newer translation of Some Answered Question. So we begin with the value of physical existence, and as we have said, I don't need to say much about this because we spent a lot of time on it with the idea of the metaphorical nature of physical reality. That what is the total title of the chapter is, you can't, I don't know if you can see it, but is the value of physical existence for spiritual beings. So in other words, if we are essentially spiritual, why do we need to have a physical existence? Obviously, the Creator has designed our lives that way, and as we have already discussed at fairly good length in the book on the metaphorical nature of physical reality and the purpose of physical reality, that this life provides us a beginning workshop or classroom where we can do the following things. We can learn gradually about spiritual concepts through allegorical exercises. That sounds very haughty and so forth, but it's simply taken, it means we first, like children, come across playthings, namely the objects of nature, our relationship with nature and with each other, and we learn that there are, in addition to spiritual principles at work, physical principles at work, there are spiritual principles as well. Now, as we will learn later in this discussion, the one overriding or or abiding image that Abdu'l-Baha uses, which is so useful in this concept, is the concept of love as the organizing force of the spiritual world, which is expressed metaphorically in the physical world by the concept of magnetism, the magnetic attraction of one mass to another. So that's the organizing force of the cosmos, even as love is the organizing force of spiritual reality. And so that's the way in which these two ostensibly contrary forms of existence express one another. That this physical experience helps us turn that learning into habituated responses, so that our soul itself becomes progressively changed. We've discussed that before, the sort of pendulum effect, where the knowledge which we begin with is put into meaningful action, so we may understand justice, as we've talked about before, but we don't really understand it until we experience it or implement it in our lives. So if injustice is done to us, we understand what its antithesis is, justice, and we try to find it in our own lives and to express it in our own lives. And then the more we express it, as we've said before, the sort of pendulum effect, the more we understand it, the more broadly we can express it, whether as individuals and then as a family and then as a neighborhood and so on. Helps us in the long-term goal for our planet of bringing, that should be, about a global commonwealth based on Baha'u'llah's design for a just, loving, and practical society whose foundation, or the God particle, as I've been calling it in the last few classes, will ever remain the local community. Well, I don't need to say a whole lot more about this because we've discussed it in the first two books in this sequence. The second chapter, In Search of the Beloved, the mystery of the hidden mystery. The hidden mystery we've talked about throughout this course. It is, if you will, the primal point from which is generated all creation, the idea of God which is transformed into creation itself. And the idea of God in this hadith, called the hadith of the hidden treasure, is I loved thee, therefore I brought the creation into being. Excuse me. I was hidden. I was a hidden mystery. I wished to be known. Therefore, I brought creation into being that I might be known. But of course, the primary focus of that process is the human being. So in order to have the human being being able to have an experience of learning to recognize the source of God in all things and all of our actions, we have been given a soul capable of rational thought and recognition and meditation and reflection, and we've been given free will in order to implement that, which is the ultimate goal, is the transformation of our souls, that we may participate in a process that begins with our inception, which recurs during the process of conception, and continues endlessly. We'll get a broader picture of that as we go along in this book and as we go through other books. So we come to know God, the hidden treasure, and he's hidden because, of course, we cannot ever know God directly. He is too vast, beyond our understanding, as we can imagine as we look at the new images that come out almost a weekly basis from the James Webb Telescope, and we see how vast the universe is, how many planets there must be, and how many planets on which there is life, and we realize that a God capable of ministering to each of those must be quite beyond anything we can comprehend. But we do know his manifestations. So he gives us teachers that enable us to navigate this classroom. And the closest that I've said before, that I think we can come to understanding God's motive in this, because it's not, it's totally altruistic. God is self-sufficient. He does not need our love, but he knows that by accepting his love, we will become joyful and godly beings ourselves. And as I said, the parental model, that is, as I said before, why do we have children? They are a test. They are difficult to raise well. It is the most challenging job you will ever have to do in this life, and to do it well is one of the greatest gifts you can give. And this, of course, in my opinion, is the closest we can come to understanding the motive of God's bringing about creation. He wants to be able to have a being capable not only of receiving his love, but of returning it. And so we have that wonderful hidden word that we'll come across, love me that I may love thee. If thou lovest me not, my love can in no wise reach thee. And so you have this concept that God is ever ready to love us, but he's not going to impose it on us. We have to be not only recognized that this being exists and is ready to love us, but to be receptive, which would involve communion with God and so on. And so this indirect methodology, having to go through this physical experience first, has great value. Then there is the unity of creation. And what I mean by that in this particular chapter is that the totality of creation is really one system. And so when we talk about the universe, we're not talking about just planet Earth, or we're not just talking about our solar system or our galaxy. We're talking about all that has been created by God, whether in the spiritual realm or the physical realm, because they're inseparable. One does not exist without the other. And so that is what is meant by the unity of creation, that not only the two dimensions of creation, but the way they interact is the law, and the laws that bind them together are part of this expression of the unity of God's purpose as expressed in creation. And so our part in this process, of course, is to recognize the Creator through the manifestation and see it at work in our evident in everything we encounter, especially, of course, we can in other people, most prominently in other people. And then also it spreads out to just everything we encounter, whether it's anything as simple as rocks and their beautiful formations and resplendence, all the way up through the plants, the animal kingdom, and so on. You see so many pictures, of course, online, particularly on Facebook and so on, of people in relation to animals. The Dodo, D-O-D-O, is a website that I strongly recommend about, of course, it's primarily about rescue animals and the transformation of this sometimes wild beast or feral beast or abandoned, usually dogs and so on, and you see them transformed by love. And you think, well, you think this is so wonderful and so on. And of course, the thought occurs to you, well, why don't we have such a website about children? Well, there's a reason for that, and we'll get to it. But the simple answer is that when a child has been abused, abandoned, you don't have some 6 months or 6 years to reform or mend that child. It's not so easy with a human being. But you see the power of love. The bridge between realities, the manifestation is intermediary, and we've talked about this before, that the manifestation is like a mirror the pros and cons of that analogy are, as I've said before, that sometimes when Baha'is use this analogy to talk to other people about the faith and explain the concept of progressive revelation and the manifestation as the central figure in that process, we say that, well, the sun is too bright and infinite, and we can't stand to look at the sun, so it's beyond us. Therefore, we look at the mirror, which reflects the qualities of the sun, and we are able to see the qualities of the sun in it. Well, that's not the way it should be explained. That's not really useful, because again, if it's a perfect mirror, as the manifestation is, then you're going to have the same brightness and the same inability to look at it. The value of it is that what the mirror, a perfect mirror, does is reflect the qualities of the sun, its warmth, its light, and its life-giving force. And so that's why, of course, as I've showed you before, I use the prism analogy, which I think maybe in some cases might work better, because it translates the seemingly one color of whiteness or brightness into discernible attributes of colors. The brain analogy, the same thing occurs here. Even as the manifestation is the intermediary or transceiver, as I call the brain, between the heavenly reality and our reality, both in his words as he talks about it, but also in his person. So the brain functions, and this isn't a totally accurate analogy, but it works a little bit, that the brain takes the information that it receives through the senses and conveys it to the mind or the understanding. It's likened to a transceiver in this sense. In your room right now, there are all kinds of things going on, conversations, movies, and so on. But you don't hear them or see them unless you have a transceiver, unless you have something that will interpret those images from electronic waves into television, a television receiver, or a radio, or your cell phone, and so on. So that's kind of what the brain does. And here's an example. You have the spiritual realm, and you want the spiritual realm to become reflected in the physical realm, but it can't do that directly, because the spiritual realm is non-physical, and we can't see it. We can only know about it. And so you have an indirect relationship with the manifestation as mirror, and there is the means by which we understand, through his example, through his teachings, the nature of the spiritual realm to which we are inevitably bound to enter. And so you want transparency, as I've said before. That is as a mirror, the manifestation gives a clear and untrammeled view of what pure spirituality is like, as it is borne out in human action. The prism metaphor, again, the Holy Spirit is this bright light emanating from the realm of the Spirit, from God. And the Holy Spirit not only animates the realm of the Spirit, but also when it is penetrating or being filtered through the manifestation, you see his utterances, his examples, all the qualities and attributes he manifests, which is why we call him a manifestation. He not only talks about spirituality, he manifests it and all of its attributes. And then this is sort of a silly slide, but I like to include it. I've included it before. This is of course, the painting from the Sistine Chapel where the hand of God is empowering Adam, bringing life to Adam and bringing Adam into being. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So you have the gap, this important gap, because God doesn't directly empower Adam, but indirectly through the intermediary of the manifestation. Of course, Adam, as we know, was a manifestation in the well, in some place he's part of an allegory in Genesis, and then elsewhere, particularly in the Quran and in the Baha'i writings, he is talked about as a manifestation. And so very cutely, I put thanks, I needed that. The manifestation as all-knowing physician. And this passage you are probably familiar with, but I will read it because it's so important in describing the fact that the manifestation knows what is needed in every age in which he appears, that distinguishes the needs of that age from the prior age or what will follow in the next dispensation. The all-knowing physician hath his finger on the pulse of mankind. He perceiveth the disease and prescribeth in his unerring wisdom the remedy. Every age hath its own problem, and every soul its particular aspiration. The remedy the world needeth in its present day afflictions can never be the same as that which a subsequent age may require. Be anxiously, and this is our part in this, be anxiously concerned with the needs of the age ye live in, and center your deliberations on its exigencies and requirements. And of course, these are the exigencies and requirements that are conveyed to us through the plans of the House of Justice, who are infallibly guided to guide us. The Genesis myth. Now, of course, these are chapters, so they discussed a lot more detail in the book. The Genesis myth. If you read, and we could spend many hours on this, but the Adamic myth is told twice in Genesis. One seems very clearly to be about the evolution of man on our planet, his coming into being. And as I said, I think it was last class, but before, in this analogy, Adam is the evolved physical being of man, who in time, when he is ready, becomes aware of this power latent within him, which is his soul, or the rational faculty. And so these are, in effect, these constitute the two dimensions of the human being, the physical and the spiritual. So Eve, as I say here, is there from the beginning, but the incipient brain or soul or rational mind must be awakened, stimulated, and exercised to understand and manifest its capacity. Now, of course, this discussion is getting into the question of evolution, but it's also dismissing the concept that the Earth began 6,000 years ago, as believed by some literalist interpretations of biblical scripture. So, as we know so far, it's been about 4.5 billion years since our Earth broke off from the sun or began to form. So, how the Creator creates evolution as a divine process. Now, I said this is the chapter where I got it wrong, and I'll explain to you why. From the writings, one might infer that man evolves while other life is evolving, rather than man evolving from other life. Now, this is stated correctly, but in the original book, I understood a passage from Abdu'l-Baha to mean that there's two parallel evolving systems. So that you have these beings that are evolving into various plant and animal life and so on. But at the same time, man is evolving as a separate entity or a separate thing. You have parallel evolutions and so on. And I realized that no, that's impossible. That to put it the way that Paul Lample did when I was talking to him about this, he said, the simplest way to look at it is this. In the beginning, you have the earth as, this gaseous, fiery glob of stuff. And then over time, man comes into being. Well, man had to come from something that was evolving during this whole millions of years of process. In short, the latent existence of the human being is there from the beginning, but must await that should be full development before ready for active or conscious or witting participation in his own progress. Now, this brings to bear the question of at what point does the manifestation intervene? From the beginning, when life was evolving so that various creatures from the sea went to the land, was one of them a manifestation saying, come on, it's really pleasant out of the water. I mean, that's kind of strange. But we do know that the manifestation is at work, at least from the realm of the spirit, if not directly active in this process. The limitations of our understanding about how the lesser peace will come about. I stuck this in that this is about the whole process by which the manifestation, and this is talking more about the present age, is at work even though he has passed on, that each manifestation oversees the progress of his own dispensation, of his own religion. And this is a statement from Shoghi Effendi that is so powerful, but it's a beautiful poem, really. It's an analogy, but it's very poetic. So listen to this, and then I'll show you a diagram I put together to illustrate the power of this as I understand it. Not ours, puny mortals that we are, to attempt at so critical a stage in the long and checkered history of mankind, to arrive at a precise and satisfactory understanding of the steps which must successively lead a bleeding humanity, wretchedly oblivious of its God and careless of Baha'u'llah, from its Calvary to its ultimate resurrection. Of course, there's an analogy there, allusion to Christ. Not ours the living witnesses of the all-subduing potency of his faith. To question for a moment, and however dark the misery that enshrouds the world, the ability of Baha'u'llah to forge with the hammer of his will and through the fire of tribulation upon the anvil of this travailing age, and in the particular shape his mind has envisaged, these scattered and mutually destructive fragments into which a perverse world has fallen, into one single unit, solid and indivisible, able to execute his design for the children of men. That's very powerful. And of course, the sense of it is even more potent daily as our world gets more and more ineffectual in dealing with the problems that affect every one of its inhabitants. And so I put together this graphic. So this, if you will, the hammer of the will of Baha'u'llah is hammering the various fragments of the civilization we're living in, which have been heated by the fire of tribulation so that they're malleable. And he's making it into a design that only he can fully understand, though he describes it pretty well in the Kitab-i Agdas, and even designs, tells us of the blueprints for that design. And then the anvil is the travailing age. So you presume there's a fire under here, as there inevitably is, or it's already been in the fire of tribulation for this blacksmith. And that's what this is an image of, is a blacksmith at work. And so the anvil is the travailing age against which Baha'u'llah is hammering us and our society in its confusion into a totally different form. It's a beautiful idea, or it's expressed beautifully. What we are able to do, ours rather, and this is a continuation of that same passage. So since we cannot understand how Baha'u'llah is going to forge this with the hammer of his will, what can we do? Ours rather, the duty, however confused the scene, however dismal the present outlook, however circumscribed the resources we dispose of, to labor serenely, confidently, and unremittingly to lend our share of assistance to whichever way circumstances may enable us, to the operation of the forces which, as marshaled and directed by Baha'u'llah, and of course now by the House of Justice through his guidance of the House, are leading humanity out of the valley of misery and shame, misery and shame to the loftiest summits of power and glory. Such beautiful writing, such powerful writing on the part of the Guardian. As I've said early in our course, we're so fortunate the Guardian was a genius in so many arenas of capacity. And his poetic language is one of those arenas. What the Creator creates, the great chain of being. Now, this is a metaphor that is shown here, and it's the idea of, from the Middle Ages, they thought of a chain, and this was a metaphor, but taken literally in some senses, and that is, you have all of creation from the rocks up to God, that is from the rocks, and they included fire as one element, plants, beasts or animals, then the human being, and then the heavenly realm where you have the various orders of angels, and then finally God. Milton describes this at great length in Paradise Lost. So you have this idea of a metaphor about the degrees of capacity inherent in all created things, from the lowliest mineral to the most highly developed human being. In a sense, the human process of evolution goes through every link in this chain, or every rung on this ladder. Both the ladder and a chain with various links are good metaphors, or good symbols of this idea of the whole sequence of creation. And of course, those of you who've read, not only in Some Answered Questions, but in other talks that Abdul Baha gives, he talks a great deal about how every part of creation is linked to every other part of creation, and every part, in effect, eventually evolves into every other part. And every part, and this is the idea of the chain, is that every part is essential to every other part. So we could not live as human beings if it weren't for all the rest of creation. Well, that's enough for tonight. We are going to need a second class on that, so we're halfway through. So we'll begin with cosmology next time, and quantum physics. That's where we get into the discussion of a quark was supposed to be the smallest, the sort of God particle, and then an individual whom I will talk about next time split the quark. And so we find out that, wait a minute, according to Abdul Baha, everything in physical creation is composite, even as everything in spiritual creation is non-composite. And he goes on to state the rule that everything that is composed must in time decompose. That's the way it is meant to be. So our planet composes, and in time it will decompose. Even as other planets are coming into being and going out of being, and other solar systems are coming into being and going out of being, and on up the line, from galaxies to galaxy clusters and beyond. So we'll discuss, in effect, what is the smallest thing in existence according to science, as opposed to what the Baha'i writings say, and what is the size of the cosmos, of the universe, according to the Baha'i writings, versus what scientists say.